Okay, well, welcome everyone to this spin book launch for Jeff Whyte's book, The Birth of Psychological War. This is being held through the SPIN network. SPIN stands for Security, Power, Ignorance Research Network. For those of you who don't know, we're an interdisciplinary group of academics, started in the southwest of England, but have since moved out from there. And what we're interested in doing is focusing on power, politics, and issues of, yeah, secrecy and ignorance. We run a number of online events as part of this network, which includes book launches. Yeah, and today we have, as I said, Jeff Whyte's recent book, The Birth of Psychological War, that we'll talk about. For those of you who don't know Jeff, he's a lecturer in international relations at Lancaster University, and his work has been in the area of critical military and security studies. In particular, he's focused on the significance of information, knowledge, communication, and war, looking at, I suppose, in particular, kind of two aspects of the political history of war, psychological warfare and cyber warfare. And we're going to hear about the former today. Jeff received his PhD in geography from the University of British Columbia. He's held grants from the US Library of Congress, the British Academy, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to have him today to talk about his book that we have there on the screen. So Jeff's going to talk for maybe 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for question and answers. So please, if you want to put any questions you have in the chat as we're kind of going along, we can compile those and then have those at the end. But of course, if you just want to come in at the end with a question too, I mean that's fine as well. And yeah, without further ado, I can turn it over to Jeff. And please, yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian, for that lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for coming this afternoon to hear about my book, which is a few years old now. But I was in the first year of my post when this book came out, so I was busy writing lectures for a bunch of modules rather than promoting my book. So thanks to the network for giving me a chance to introduce it again. So yeah, this is a project. This is basically my PhD research that I did at UBC. Which was in Canada, of course, so it took me 8 years to do. But as a result, I think I was happy with what I came away with, and I'll take you through a few of the chapters today, especially the first two, which I think is where I kind of really make the argument of the book. But I want to offer maybe a bit of context first for where I was coming from in approaching the research and the writing as well. So really, it kind of the context is that when I was sort of coming to like political awareness, it was during the War on Terror, and you might remember this enthusiasm in the early 2000s around winning hearts and minds, right? This idea that the U.S. would be greeted as liberators in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that its expertise in the social sciences could help it win counterinsurgency warfare. And so, one of the things that I found so interesting about this was this idea, and I want to sort of flag these from the beginning, is that a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today, I think, are actually still very much with us, especially this relationship between air power and bombing and psychological war. So here's an article from 2001 on Psy-War in Afghanistan, quoting, "While B-52s rain terror from the skies, an elaborate psychological operation is fighting for the hearts and minds of Afghanistan." So already we're seeing this idea of psychological war as something elaborate, a technical, scientific body of knowledge that can be used to change opinion in foreign countries, and also a strange relationship between this psychological war and air power. What Time is very candidly referring to here as sort of terror, right? The use of terror. Here's the BBC saying Taliban fighters are defecting as US-led airstrikes continue, and that if an adversary's will to fight can be removed, it follows that lives can be saved. So again, a very strange claim that psychological war combines with air power to save lives, right? A curious argument. And here's the Chicago Tribune in 2003 saying that the goal of psychological war is to avoid bloodshed by prompting the surrender of enemy troops. Um, so this is what I sort of argue is the sort of liberal humanitarian thesis on psychological war, right? This idea that psychological war is a way to reduce the violence of war, to replace the violence of war, to make it more humane. And this is sort of one of the ideas that I'm going to challenge today. So, I mean, if you follow the war on terror at all, or the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, you don't need me to tell you that the battle for hearts and minds didn't go all that well. Um, and so very quickly, my early interest in the project, my sort of, I think, naive fascination with this idea of, oh, what is the US doing to control people's minds? Very quickly turned to, well, how did we come to believe that we were capable of doing this in the first place? So the project took a bit of an historical turn, right? I tried to answer that question, um, doing a sort of, my conceit is sort of doing like a Foucauldian genealogy of psychological war as an idea in international politics. And I always joke that I disappoint my readers somewhat because it sounds like I'm going to reveal all the secrets of psychological war and the ways that the US, army is controlling minds, and where actually I'm sort of critiquing this idea and that this is in fact possible. So one of the things that I want to account for is the origin of the idea, or of the term psychological warfare. And this is an engram, right? A Google, so Google graph that shows the instances of a word in the English language over time. So as you can see here, psychological warfare as a concept just doesn't exist before the 1940s. So I tried to sort of account for where this came from and how we started using this term. And there's a few things that are, I think, pertinent here. One is that the word propaganda becomes a dirty word in the interwar years. All of the people in the belligerent countries of the First World War come to terms with how much sort of really vulgar propaganda there was in the First World War, and states are trying to distance themselves from the charge of doing propaganda. So psychological war, I think, on the face of it, claims to be something more than this, right? Some kind of expertise or some sort of technical knowledge. So if you try to trace the history of psychological war, you look at sort of the conventional histories of psychological war, you might find a lot of books like these. These are the post-war retrospectives on US psychological warfare in the Second World War, written by often practitioners like Paul Linebarger or Daniel Lerner. But these sort of give an account of psychological war's institutionalization within US foreign policy. And when you look at these books, they all do an interesting thing. After the fact, they project the history of psychological warfare sort of back into history. So we have Daniel Linebarger, Paul Linebarger saying one of the earliest applications was Gideon's ruse against the Midianites in the Old Testament. So he takes psychological war all the way back to the Old Testament. You have Wilbur Schramm, who's writing for the Johns Hopkins Operations Research Office, saying that psychological warfare is one of the nations have been waging it since there have been nations, right? So we've always had it. And Daniel Lerner, the sort of who becomes one of these modernization theorists in the 1950s at MIT, and in the 1960s, reimagines all of these historical figures as psychological warriors. So the point here being that they all sort of naturalize psychological warfare into the history of war, as if it has this sort of elemental reality within war itself. So I set out to contest this, and actually says, well, no one used this concept before. What was the actual significance and stakes of this concept entering political discourse in 1940? So I did a hyper advanced methodology of searching for the word in popular newspaper databases, which actually yielded some interesting results. Um, so in the New York Times, for example, the first instance of the phrase psychological war came in this advertisement for a book called The Strategy of Terror that was written in 1940 by a guy named Edmund Taylor, who was a journalist for the Chicago Tribune for its Paris branch. He was in Paris when the Nazis invaded and occupied the city, and he was able to flee and escape. And he wrote an account of that in which he purported to describe Nazi psychological war tactics. And it was really the sort of key piece of the puzzle for me in figuring this out was discovering who Edmund Taylor was. Someone that has not really been commented much upon or written about. Um, and the answer to that question is Edmund Taylor was an intelligent asset for the United States, for this very early intelligence organization called the Office of the Coordinator of Information, or the COI. And the COI was a predecessor organization to the OSS, which people know a lot more about, which was itself predecessor organization to the CIA. And people who do research on U.S. intelligence history will know of the OSS and even the COI. It was established by William Donovan, right? Wild Bill Donovan, this guy who's regarded as the sort of grandfather of the CIA. So Taylor is a journalist that is recruited by Donovan. And here again, I think a little bit of context is important. The context here in 1941 is that Britain's on the back foot in the war. Britain's desperate for the United States to enter the war, but American public opinion is staunchly against it. Americans mostly, overwhelmingly want to see Britain win, but their idea is that's Europe's problem. This is Europe's war. It's not our problem. We've got these two big oceans to protect us. We're not getting involved. So one of the things that FDR, the president at the time, does is he empowers William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, to create this intelligence organization to especially liaise with British intelligence to try to move public opinion, among other things, to move public opinion towards intervention. And so, slide here. And there's lots of histories written about this. The CIA's own in-house historian, Thomas Troy, has written several books about this, Donovan and CIA. Donovan ends up working together with a Canadian representative, this industrialist, William Stevenson, or Intrepid, as his spy name. And they sort of work together to try to move American public opinion. And there's a monument now in Canada, in the suburb of Toronto, where the British, it's called the British Security Coordination, was the sort of British outfit that was working together with Donovan. And there's a big plaque and monument in Oshawa, in a suburb of Toronto now. But sort of back to the story, Taylor is one of these journalists cultivated by Donovan, and Taylor stays really loyal to Donovan throughout the war. He becomes a part of the OSS, and he's loyal to him through several sort of interagency disputes, and they become actually quite really close. And so what does Taylor do as sort of part of the COI? Well, he starts publicizing the idea of this new form of warfare that he's calling psychological war, right? And in this new form of warfare, public opinion becomes this new battlefield, right, that everyone's sort of involved in. And remember, of course, it's public opinion that FDR is trying to move in the first place. So we start to get this inkling here that public opinion is no longer, at least as the story goes, something that reflects sort of the public's political will, but something that the public becomes responsible for, right? It's becoming enrolled in the war itself. So, yeah, where am I? So Taylor's, and he writes this really big spread in the New York Times. He writes a big spread in Fortune magazine as well, in addition to his book, The Strategy of Terror. And what's interesting about these things is it doesn't really reveal a lot of the secrets of German psychological war. Rather, it intimates them. And I think for the spin group here, this is sort of interesting because this is a theme that we see come up in a lot of our works, is the way a secret is often pointed to, and there's a lot of publicity that's generated around a secret that is not revealed. I think this is like a paradigmatic case of that, right? So Taylor kind of builds this sort of edifice around psychological war without ever really showing what it actually is or what it's about. And he'll say things like this. This is a direct quote from The Strategy of Terror. Quote, psychological war is, quote, scientific knowledge of the inner forces which determine opinion and control nerves. So this is very fantastical, right? It's a very mechanical view of human nature and public opinion, and the idea that psychological war is has this ability to frictionlessly manipulate um, uh, publics and also foreign publics, right? Which I think there's a big difference there. Um, and there's also something kind of pulpy about this. There's a pulp fiction kind of quality, and I go so far as in the book to call psychological warfare, at least in this iteration, as a kind of social science fiction. And so here's an excerpt from his book to give you a sense of the flavor. This is him describing German psychological warfare in France. Quote, it was like some magical war of witch doctors in the jungle, primitive savages willing one another to destruction. And in fact, the mentality of some of the arch propagandists like Goebbels seemed to me very close to that of primitive witch doctors. Yet, the cold-blooded technical organization and the scientific knowledge back of this modern magic were very far from the jungle. German propaganda was scientifically controlled and checked in a special psychological laboratory attached to the Ministry of Propaganda. Now, this is pretty fantastic, right? And as far as I can tell, this is completely fabricated about the psychological laboratory. And it actually mirrored extant discourses around geopolitics as this other super scientist for German global domination. And there was an idea that there was Karl Haushofer, the political geographer, had a geopolitical laboratory in Munich that also doesn't seem to have existed, at least as far as sort of geographers can determine it. But I think there's a couple of so really what I'm trying to argue here with this chapter is to show that psychological warfare arrives in political discourse itself as a kind of propaganda, right? It's a propaganda about propaganda, which is sort of convoluted, but that's the sort of I think that's the best way to understand these sort of early iterations of psychological war. And I make the argument sort of two key things, two sort of theoretical arguments that I take away from this. Um, the first is that what psychological war purports to do anyway is to enroll the public and enroll individuals as such into the war. And here's a line from the advertisement for Taylor's book. Again, using this second person address, which is really pointed, and you see the second person a lot in sort of psychological war media. It hails you directly, right? You are public opinion. Therefore, you are an enemy objective. So I think what Taylor's doing and what these early writers or sort of advertisers of psychological war are trying to do is to have ordinary people imagine themselves not as passive spectators of war, not as political civilians who are involved in democratic reasoning or processes, but as active combatants in war, right? And these Taylor calls them nerve privates. You're a nerve private. You're on the front line. Like the home front has become the front line because you're actively now participating in the war, whether you like it or not. And of course, this is in a certain sense just total war, right? But everyone's involved. But this goes beyond economic and industrial production. And I argue, and I use in the book, I sort of go into more sort of Foucauldian theory around confession and making yourself the object of your own discourse, in those sort of like later Foucault books. But the argument I kind of want to make here is that I think that psychological war encourages people or it interpolates people in a way that you have to think about yourself and think about your own thoughts, feelings, and beliefs as something that's now part of the war. You have to understand your relationship to yourself is mediated by war, and that this is something for which you're now responsible. So it creates a sense of personal obligation over all these things. This is at least, I think, how the early discourses of psychological war go. And the second argument that I make is that psychological war at least claims to change the geography of war, sort of fundamentally change the geography of war. And if you don't believe me, you can maybe take it from Nelson Rockefeller, who's speaking here. Coincidentally, the day before Pearl Harbor attack, he was speaking to a social club, and he's saying, this is an account of his speech, that, and it's on the slide here, Germany has perfected the present methods of political, economic, and psychological warfare. So all of a sudden, this word's getting used all the time. He continues, we now know that total warfare affects not only two lines of men facing each other, it affects all men. It affects nations in their entirety. It demands an outpouring of resources, which is not only physical, it calls for a complete preoccupation of spiritual, moral, and mental forces. Thus, it had created a new geography of defense. And that's the name of this chapter, is this claim that it fundamentally changes geography. So I think there's also a geographical imagination to psychological war. And this is actually borne out. The other sort of interesting thing from this chapter is it's not just psychologists and other social scientists who sort of get on board, though they do. Geographers are also really involved. If I had more time, I would explain the figure of Ewald Bantz, who's a German geographer, who's sort of interesting. But you get all of these American geographers also lining up to discuss psychological war. And the one that's particularly interesting here is this one on the right, Derwent Whittlesey's German Strategy of World Conquest. And what's particularly interesting is that the co-author of this book is Richard Hartshorne, who becomes the longtime president of the American Association of Geographers. But also in 1942, the same year this book comes out, he becomes the head of the OSS research and analysis branch. So he's the head honcho, essentially, of all of the social scientists who are now working for the OSS. So he's sort of involved in this sort of broader network. But if we look at what geographers are saying, they're all talking about psychological war. Applied psychology as a weapon of war means propaganda intended to influence the mental attitude of nations. The map has become a psychological weapon in a warring world where the souls of men are as strongly attacked as their lives. So again, this is really kind of grandiose stuff, right? And then Whittlesey and Hartshorne, the contribution of psychology to practical statecraft has awakened the German mass mind. So geographers are really getting involved in sort of constructing this idea of psychological war. And here's a map in Whittlesey and Hartshorne's book that's excerpted from a German geopolitical journal called Zeitschrift für Geopolitik, which was really famous. This was Karl Haushofer, the German political geographer, his journal, that Whittlesey and Hartshorne are publishing to show sort of German designs and indeed global designs on America, right, on South America. So this immediately, as a sort of rhetorical map, is an affront to American Monroe Doctrine prerogatives, right? But also there's an implicit kind of argument here. And again, I think this is crucial to the geographical imagination of psychological war, is that it doesn't respect the boundaries of space or the friction of distance, right? This is a very messy map on purpose, right? It's chaotic. It's showing battle lines, right? And Edmund Taylor also says this again and again and again, that psychological war is not bound by time or space, right? That it transcends time or space. So there's this kind of implicit like idea of time-space compression here, what geographers call time-space compression, right? And particularly, I think the rhetoric here supports an anti-isolationist position. Because remember, the isolationist position is that, hey, the US, we're fine over here. We've got these two big oceans. We're safe. That's Europe's problem. We're not afraid of Asia. But what psychological war seems to say is, no, you're not isolated. In fact, the war is already here. Psychological war is already happening. You're already taking place in it. And if you're not sort of enthusiastic about joining the war, then you're already falling victim to it, right? And of course, it's probably a good thing that the United States did intervene in the war, right? But this is the sort of again, just thinking about the geographical imagination here, the psychological war sort of claims to obviate the possibility of isolation. Not only that isolation is not preferable, but it's impossible, right? So to kind of recap this chapter, again, I think psychological war, the early discourses, sort of propose this fundamentally changed relationship between ordinary civilians, between everyday life and war, such that like, you become an object of war, right? You're involved in war through your participation in public opinion. And then also that it's changed the geography of war fundamentally. And so we see, and I should mention this idea of morale as well, because these are sort of twin concepts. The idea of psychological war as the ability to attack another country, and civilian morale as a kind of substance or a quantity that can be built up, it can be defended, but as we'll see shortly, also something that can be attacked, right? So yeah, my second chapter of the book sort of looks at the evolution of American psychological warfare agencies, what are now starting to be called psychological war, as the United States enters the war and is pursuing the North African theater and then eventually the Western Front. Which is sort of ironic, right? This is American entrepreneurial optimism, right? This thing that we sort of made up, we now believe we're able to do. But it's also really there's a lot of hand wringing about this as well. So you get this institutional division between OSS, which we talked about, and the OWI, which is the Office of War Information, which in 1953 becomes the United States Information Agency. And the idea here is that the OSS does covert, black, secret operations, and the OWI does overt, truthful operations, right? And this is where we see the beginning of this idea of the strategy of truth, or this idea that the truth is our weapon, which you hear over and over and over again when you read anything that comes out of the United States Information Agency, this idea of a strategy of truth. And again, this is the idea that psychological war can be more than just vulgar deception or lies, like base lies, right? It can be productive, it can be positive, it can be used to build morale, right? And then this can be done at remove. This can be done at a distance as well. So we see this idea of, in the figure of the white bomb, this idea of, or a truth bomb, if you like. This is from an OWI pamphlet, an overview of its activities from 1942. And I mean, what we really see here is the idea behind the strategy of truth is also the US realizing that things that look like propaganda aren't that effective, right? So effective propaganda has a neutral tone. It sort of mimics the objective tones of journalism, right? Which isn't entirely new, but this is kind of how they're starting to do it. So they're looking at newspapers and things like that as the model for propaganda. But I think the idea of the white bomb also gives us another sort of hint or inkling towards this relationship that I mentioned at the outset between air power and psychological war, because these are things that kind of grow up at the same time, at the same moment in history, in the Second World War. And this is more than just a figurative or a metaphorical connection too, right? The first like leaflets that are used, and oh, my lights have gone off because I've stayed still too long. The first leaflets that are dropped by the United States anyway in the Second World War are literally loaded into bombshells, right? And sort of dropped onto targets, or they're just dropped out of planes that would otherwise be carrying bombs. So the form of psychological wars is quite literally that of bombing, but also the content is often has a lot to do with bombing. So these two sort of Psy-war leaflets, one for German audiences, one for French, sort of advertise the scale of the American and also British bombing campaign, right? The left, we see bombs rain over Germany. And on the right, we see the Ruhr underwater. This was the bombing of the of the dams in the Ruhr in Germany. So we see this, again, American psychological war is so often about its own air power, right? And advertising its power and its efficacy. And so again, we see this is from the RAF actually, but we see this, the heaviest bombardments to date, right? The uneven ability of Germany versus the Allies to bomb. We see the same leaflet for German audiences with this sort of taunting message, right? It says Fortress Europe has no roof, right? It's like, oh, you may be able to defend against the ground, but we're able to bomb you, right? So this idea of attacking morale. And I think as the further you go from Europe, the more sort of taunting and vitriolic these appeals get as well. These are pamphlets for Japan, right? And you can see also that very vividly illustrated is advertising American air power. And here's an indicative line from one of the from these leaflets, again, addressed directly to Japanese civilians. We want you to see how powerless the military is to protect you. Systematic destruction of city after city will continue as long as you blindly follow your military leaders. So again, I'm trying to point here to the way that these two practices emerged together at the same time. And what a lot of the sort of theorists who are internally, within the military and the US government and the Allied structure are trying to, the way that they're thinking is that bombing can be more than just a strategy to kill and destroy, though it's certainly this, that bombing can actually be a kind of communication to populations and to political leaders. And there's this idea that enough bombing can sort of produce this like torture of the body politic, of the civilian body, such that they will rise up and overthrow their leaders. And we see this articulated again and again. I think we see this today, right? This is part of the, you see this in discourses around Gaza. If Israel bombs enough in the Gaza Strip, then people will surely get tired of it and rise up and overthrow Hamas, right? I don't think this has ever happened. If you can think of a case where people have overthrown a government because of being bombed by a foreign power, let me know. I mean, I do think it's kind of a fig leaf, but still, we see the origins of this kind of idea at this point, and I think it's still very much with us today. But the idea here is that psychological war ends up as a way to what I call refining the terror of air power, right? To make air power more socially legible to its victims, as opposed to it being just an unexplained ultimatum. And so the idea that, and this sort of, emerges out of 19th century colonial practice of air policing, pacification through air power, and things like that. But it's an idea and it's an enthusiasm for this idea that, well, what if social science could be used to help make air power, use air power as a social lever, right? And of course, we know that this didn't work, right? The experience of the Blitz, the experience of Pearl Harbor showed that bombing tends to strengthen the resolve of its victims, right? People tend to be indignant and hate the enemy rather than this sort of collapse of morale that causes people to overthrow their government. And indeed, there were all kinds of social scientists at the time who were trying to tell commanders this, but they didn't want to hear it. There was an anthropologist named Alexander Leighton who lamented in a very quite cutting line. He says, this is a quote here. He tried to tell them that it wasn't working. He said, the military uses social science the way a drunk uses a lamppost, which is for support rather than illumination, which I think is a funny line. But to conclude this, so again, what I take away from this chapter is that, well, one, that practices of bombing and air power and practices of psi war kind of grow up at the same time in the Second World War. And it relies on this fiction that civilian morale is the substance that can be broken down or destroyed by through violence and especially through air power. And what I articulate more in the book is that this really goes against the kind of liberal humanitarian thesis around Psy-War, right? This idea that Psy-War is about saving lives or reducing violence or providing alternatives, making war more humane or less kinetic. No way. When you actually look at the history of Psy-War and bombing together, psychological war often provides the exact rationale for bombing. So it actually provides an avenue to widen the scope of violence, especially against civilian populations, and provides a justification for doing it that has a social scientific gloss. So that's the end of my second chapter. I think I maybe have time to discuss one more shorter chapter, which is the third of four, which I think is a bit more of a this is a bit of comic relief, I think, after more grim topics. Um, in the third chapter, I'm looking at um, the Cold War properly now. So looking at the sort of early 1950s and picking up on this idea of the subjectifying nature of psychological war and how psychological war tends to um, enroll its subjects. So I looked at this campaign that was run by the CIA called the Crusade for Freedom. And this was by the CIA's own accounting, quote, one of the longest running and successful covert operations uh, ever mounted by the USA. And so this is about the origins of Radio Free Europe, which you've probably heard about. Radio Free Europe, it was about broadcasting pro-Western, pro-US propaganda into the Warsaw Pact countries behind the Iron Curtain. Um, but what a lot of people don't know about Radio Free Europe is that for the first 15 years of its existence, it was run exclusively by the CIA. It was a sort of a covert operation, and it was masquerading as a civil society organization run by concerned citizens with grassroots funding by everyday Americans. And so the organization, so it's sort of nested. The Radio Free Europe was run by the Crusade for Freedom, which was run by an organization called the National Committee for a Free Europe. And then that was sort of seeded by the USA. And again, what I try to do with this chapter is show how ideas or political imaginations of propaganda abroad actually have a lot to do with consolidating ideology and propaganda at home. And so maybe I think I probably just have enough time for this one vignette maybe. Uh, but I think it's very it's funny this idea of the truth dollar. So the idea was that you could, as a private American citizen, participate in psychological warfare against the Soviet Union by donating a dollar, a truth dollar, to the Crusade for Freedom to support Radio Free Europe. And so we get this ad, you know, sure, I want to fight communism, but how? You mean I can fight communism? Right? And I think this is, um, again, it shows how I think that like the first person here is really interesting. Um, and again, it's this idea of an investment in psychological war. So you come to think about yourself not as this passive citizen, but as an active combatant in war, right? You're engaging in this kind of spiritual war. And I think there's actually something quite clever about this one. I have to hand it to him. Thinking about like the symbolism of the American dollar, of a single American dollar as a unit of political agency, as this sort of synecdoche for freedom, right? Conflating the dollar or conflating market exchange with political action, like literally voting with your dollar, right? And there's the punchline here being that for every dollar that Radio Free Europe collected from an everyday America, they lost money because they would send out these sort of prepaid envelopes. And so by the time they paid for the envelope and they paid for the administrative cost of everything, they would lose money. So every dollar lost them money. But of course, that wasn't important, right? Because it was about trying to get Americans to sort of invest more in their in this idea of fighting the Soviet Union. So I think maybe I'll leave it there for time and invite any questions. Thanks everyone for coming to the talk and listening.
Okay, Jeff, wonderful. Thanks for that. Okay. Well, we have some time now for comments. If you want to kind of voice those in a, in a kind of present way, or if you just want to put those in the chat, we can monitor both those. Yeah, Jeff, I guess maybe I'll just start while maybe other people are kind of collecting their thoughts. I was kind of struck by some of the points you raised at the beginning about talking about whether psychological warfare was the same or different from other kinds of warfare. And it reminds me of a lot of forms of, let's say, let's call it innovations, where there's this very, especially in the beginning, this very uh, I don't know, dicey time in which people have to argue about, say, whatever new technology or something. Is it the same or different than what came before? And if you think of something like I don't know, GM foods or something, crops or something like this, it's like, well, hey, it's this revolutionary new technology, deserves lots of investment. Let's get really excited about it. But it's not really different than anything we've been doing for centuries, brewing beer and all the rest of it. Um, and oftentimes, right? I mean, this the way in which similarity and differences is positioned depends on the audience. So, if you're writing a research grant, probably you might be playing up the potential GM as something novel and revolutionary and a break. But in a regulatory context, it might be like, well, no real change here. Just keep going with the existing mechanisms. We don't need anything particular new and special and all this sort of thing. So, I mean, could you just say a little bit about as psychological war is developing? I mean, are you getting these alternative kind of positionings of it as something as a continuation or a break from the past? And if that's the case, then like who is being kind of whatever targeted for which kind of message? Like, can you see like distinctive ways in which certain kinds of portrayals are put out to convince certain kinds of audiences to whatever mitigate concerns that other audiences might have? Yeah, and anything you can say along those lines.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question, and I mean that's why I think it is tempting to think about. I mean that's the sort of, as I say, the argument of a lot of the post-war retrospectives on Psy-War that I sort of showed at the beginning. It's like, well, this is something that's always existed in war, and so we're just sort of picking up the the way we're now formalizing what's always been sort of natural or an elemental part of
Mhm.
war. And I found those arguments sort of unsatisfying because the the entire thrust of psychological war when it enters the political discourse is that it's something radically and terrifyingly new, right? And it's something that hasn't been used before, it hasn't been discovered before. And indeed, it's sort of also piggybacking on like we need to remember too that psychology as a discipline, as a social science, is also sort of new at this time, and sort of
Mhm.
gaining notoriety in public. So there's an enthusiasm for this new form of knowledge. And also, I mean, yeah, you talk about audiences. One of the things that I go into detail more in the book is that uh, psychologists are really on board for this as well because they see the idea of psychological warfare as their sort of avenue into government jobs and roles in governments as sort of technocrats, right? And because of, if you think about the time too, psychology sort of had a boom in, and this is sort of discussed in like at the time in the literature among psychologists, there had been a boom in PhD enrollments in psychology in the 30s. And so when the Second World War hits, you have a lot of graduates from psychology programs who don't have jobs and sort of really line up behind this. So they have this sort of incentive to think about psychological warfare as this sort of new like break with the past and a new sort of technocratic future of war, right? Um, the other kind of answer to that question is the the sort of technology question, right? How do new technologies mediate uh, like types of political and social relations that existed beforehand? So the new technology here, and I intimated a little bit with the map about the radio broadcast, was shortwave radio. was this idea that it had just been invented that you could broadcast radio signals across oceans, right? So there's this big idea that shortwave radio was allowing for psychological war to be waged at a distance. But even that, the people making these arguments also knew lots of public opinion polling had been done on shortwave radio listenership in the United States, and nobody listened. Partially because the receivers were finicky and they were expensive, so only real hobbyists had shortwave radio receivers. And also, but the people who were hobbyists, when they were surveyed as to why they did or didn't listen to German broadcasts or broadcasts from abroad, they said, "Well, we think it's propaganda, and so we're not listening to it." So but that was part of the story, right? This idea that these new forms of communication technology, again, it was this sort of prefiguring the idea of time space compression, right? Is making things closer. um, but again, I think it's again, I think I try to like lay out in the book, it's a lot of bluster too, right? I think they really are trying to sell psychological war as something fundamentally revolutionary and radically new. And only after the war do they say, well, maybe this is similar to how things have always been.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting the history of the shifting justifications to kind of yeah move something along, right? Okay. Any questions for those people who are listening in now? Elspeth. Yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to find how to put my hand up, but I didn't find it. I will find it later. That was fantastic, Jeff. I confess I haven't read your book yet, and I need to read it clearly. So I'm going to ask an unfair question. I'm really taken with this idea of the mobilization of people into um, truth actors. This idea of how can you convince a population that they're active truth seekers or truth producers. Can you speak to any of the other ways in which we can observe that um, historically, but also today? And can I ask whether or not you think that those people who are mobilized into kind of conspiracy theory sort of circles could also be considered mobilized in that sort of way? That was the first one that jumped out at me, but I thought I would run it by you first.
Yeah, those are two really excellent questions, and something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And I mean, I think that there's not a coincidence that if we look at the sort of rise of contemporary conspiracy theories, I know I mean it's obviously overdetermined. I don't think there's like one cause, but I think it is interesting that the United States spent a whole decade in the 2000s saying that like writing things about information full spectrum dominance, like sort of trying to convince people that they had the tools at their disposal to out of whole cloth shape the minds and wills of foreign populations, right? And again, I think that's total fantasy. um, but but again, I think that kind of there is a bit of a boomerang effect to that, because the object of um, like Psywar is now so common in right-wing conspiracy theory discourses now, right? The idea that everything's a psyop, everything's Psywar, and also that it does encourage people to think about themselves again as these either sort of truth actors or sort of like the idea that you defend yourself, you defend your own mind against the whatever the woke liberal mind virus or whatever kind of thing they've got going on, right? It's the idea that you take this sort of responsibilization for your own ideological strength or whatever. And this fits in with kind of like manosphere stuff too, idea of like stealing your mind and um, be, uh, so yeah, I think that I think there's definitely something to that, and because they're all talking about like search Elon Musk's Twitter feed for psyop, right? And he had a tweet a while ago that said, "Oh, we should have a psyop of the year contest," right? And so he's trying to, um, and I think a lot of the right wing sphere kind of positions themselves as people who are either immune or they see through the psyop, right? And it also the framework of the psyop makes you can kind of twist like any information that doesn't sort of suit your worldview, you can sort of dismiss as a psyop, right? It provides this sort of malleability to reality that I think is really interesting. And I think we don't only just see that on the right. I think we see this coming out of liberal circles a lot as well. So, and this sort of dovetails to your to answer your first question is where do we see this? I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I wrote an article last year that details how in the 80s, in the first Reagan administration, uh, Reagan was worried about um, Soviet disinformation. So this idea of active measures and Soviet disinformation. And his administration was convinced, or at least they set out to argue, that the anti-war movement, specifically the anti-nuclear proliferation movement, the nuclear freeze movement, were either wittingly or unwittingly victims of Soviet disinformation, right? So if you were campaigning for peace or campaigning against nuclear proliferation, the Soviets must have gotten to you, and you don't even need to be aware of this, right? So again, it creates this idea that you have to. So this is one of the things that I've been writing about in the sort of more granular theoretical level is that it creates this idea that you have to think about yourself as an object of sort of foreign interference or foreign influence, right? And again, so it can be kind of reality bending in that way as well. We saw the same thing in 2016. I think it's easy to forget this. A lot of the Black Lives Matter movement were identified by a lot of liberals in the press as being duped by Russia, right? So if you were out there protesting for BLM, it's like this was a Russian plot to undermine American political unity. And and listen, I'm not saying that Russia wasn't trying to do those things, that they weren't buying ads on Facebook, but you can see how quickly it is to overstate that case and portray anyone who's doing kinds of activism as someone who's been compromised by psychological war or disinformation. So I think the type of like epistemic security paradigm that I sort of trying to draw attention to the history of here, I think we still see it going on a lot today.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, well, I have another question I want to ask. While others may be formulating some questions, and I want to take you back to the point you raised about I suppose the aspirations, at least at times, for psychological operations during the Second World War, and you said, there was a kind of simplistic model out there that, if you could just kind of push a message, people might buy it and so on. And I guess I wonder, can you talk a little bit about the development of psychological warfare and, I don't know, let's say the study of media effects or psychology, or I don't know, something like that, where, because I mean, I would have guessed in the 30s and 40s, I mean, you're getting development of television. I mean, there's film, there's radio, and of course, there's a rise of fascism. And a lot of people may kind of put those things together and say, well, actually, these are the new technology is actually tools for mass propaganda, and you can actually change people's minds um, through messaging. Centralized controlled messaging will have these kinds of effects. Um, but then I presume, well, I mean, after that, certainly, after the war and let's say kind of attempts to understand the effects of media provide a much more kind of nuanced kind of discussion. And I guess so I'm wondering, like, um, kind of who's pushing who here? Is there a way in which, let's say, studies on media are influencing then what people in psychological war are doing? Is it maybe what some of the psychological operations in war are kind of not able to affect? Is that influencing understandings within the academy about media and the limits of its effects? I mean, are these two kind of these two areas, the military and the academic, are they kind of interrelated with one another? Are they kind of co-developing?
Yes.
Or yeah, anyway, so yeah, thanks. Yeah, just anything along those.
Yeah, there's a really excellent book by a guy named Christopher Simpson with OUP back in the, I think, early 90s, called Science of Coercion, that documents really well the origins of mass communication studies with military funding, right? It's like one of these social scientists that's almost completely developed from defense money irrigating the academy, right? So all those early, like the journal Public Opinion Quarterly is essentially everyone who wrote for that in the 40s and 50s is in some way getting defense dollars, right? So the early like administrative communication paradigm is completely one of these, like area studies. It's like completely a result of early defense spending, and only later does communication studies kind of have its critical turn, right? Um, and then, yeah, to your first question, it's yeah, I should qualify that I don't think my skepticism around psychological war doesn't mean I don't think propaganda doesn't work ever, right? Of course it does. But I think one of the things that, and I think there's lots of evidence to show that the domestic propaganda campaign by the British and FDR did move the needle a bit on public opinion domestically, right? It didn't get them involved until Pearl Harbor, but it does. I think the main difference is that when you look at how media power works, it's not one of the early theories of communication power was that they call it the hypodermic needle model, where people think that the way influence works is you take a message and you just insert it into a polity, right? And that's how media power works, which is oddly kind of come back. I think a lot of the way that we think about media now, I think we've really, the hypodermic needle model has come back in a very strange way. But I think if we think about media power in terms of like types of capital, right? Do you have in a given place social capital, cultural capital, and political capital? And if you do, you can probably get your message out and influence public opinion probably pretty effectively. But the thing about psychological war is it's usually about trying to win hearts and minds or influence opinion in places where you don't have those forms of capital. And so how do you how is the United States or Britain going to go into Iraq or or Germany in the first, and then just change people's minds when they don't have access to sort of trusted um, uh, trusted messengers. So I think there's a geography to media power, and I think the sort of conceit of psychological war is that it can, again, this is why I argue there's a geographical imagination to it, right? That it can overcome the friction of distance, and it can assert media power in this sort of frictionless way. And I think that's what I kind of take issue with, not the idea that media effects have real power, which I think they obviously do, right? But that was a really really good question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Luca.
Hey Jeff, thank you for the talk. Sorry I was late.
Sorry.
I think it was really interesting to me that you're looking at decades that I don't generally focus on, and I was struck by the fact that based on the material you showed, it seems that a lot of the early effort at psychological warfare was driven by social science and so on, but also driven by a sense of power. So look what we can do with our knowledge, look what we can do with our technology, our bombs, and so on. Whereas if you then move basically a decade or a bit more into the 1940s and 50s, a lot of psychological warfare seems to me driven by fear. So that we have to do all these sorts of things because the Soviets are already doing them and we are falling behind, and everything is terrifying, at least if you buy the arguments that the people involved make. And I was wondering whether you agreed with this, and also if you thought that what caused this type of shift.
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure I have a good answer. I mean, I think there remains throughout even into the 60s and 70s, because the chapter of the book that I didn't get to is the chapter on the Vietnam War and the US's sort of use of psychological war as part of the counterinsurgency there. And there still is a massive arrogance to American psychological war in Vietnam, right? They're saying things like, we can rebuild these people from scratch. Like we can break them down and build them back up. We can be more effective than the military. This idea of the sort of pre-modern Vietnamese villager as sort of a malleable, something that's essentially malleable. Yeah, it's modernization theory, and it's no coincidence, Elspeth, that the one of those first books, Daniel Lerner, the guy who's like who wrote the book on psychological war, who did it in the 40s, he becomes this major modernization theorist. He writes a book called Passing of Traditional Society that's all about that is this administrative communication text that comes out of MIT's Center of International Studies, right? So yeah, the idea of psychological war gets kind of rolled into to modernization theory, and that's especially under the Kennedy administration, where they do see. I mean, so I guess if I can give you a partial answer, there is this idea that psychological war goes really global, and that the United States Information Agency sees itself as basically they stop trying to what they say, win friends and advertise themselves, and they start trying to set up communication infrastructure for friendly regimes around the world, like the Adula regime in the Congo. They're just like, we're going to set them up with political communication experts and advisors and technology. So it does become much more of a nitty-gritty part of the Cold War, and they do sort of abandon the let's advertise how great we are. But I don't have a better answer.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so Ambrose Suriano. I think you're muted.
Oh, Amber, I
Nope,
think you're
you're
muted.
muted.
There you go. Oh, can't hear
Okay.
you though. Maybe your volume is down.
Okay. Well, if you want to write something in the chat, we can pick it up. And I had a comment in the chat. Jeff, you might want to look at that, but I can read it out. Maybe a slight comment, but it seems to me that the geography element is also present in the understanding of psychology, with this idea that one's own political views would result from psychological warfare, regarding what you said about Ukraine, Black Lives Matter, anti-Vietnam War, etc. A sort of geography of the self, which I guess you probably did comment on, given the way Foucault influences
No,
your work. So yeah, would you want to?
that's the. I mean, I use that that framework a lot. Like Foucault's writing on confession, right? Like confession is about something like a truth that you are sort of encouraged or pressured to articulate about yourself. It's like speech about yourself that you say out loud in front of the presence of others in a way that binds you to the thing that you've said, right? And that's why there's so many of these in the if I'd gone on with that third chapter, the truth dollar is like one form of like speech. But the other thing that they the Crusade for Freedom did was have you sign a freedom scroll, and you say, I dedicate myself to freedom, and the fact that freedom comes from God and all this kind of stuff. And so it's just like literally this form of confession. And one of the other things that comes up so much in psychological war literature are literal catechisms. So something where it's like a 20 question and answer thing, and you're meant to kind of like run through it, right? And so it's again, you're encouraging you to say things out loud about yourself and constituting yourself as the object of your own inquiry, which is kind of what that sort of like later Foucault era stuff is all about. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I kind of write it down better than I think I'm able to say now.
Okay, and we've also got some comments in relationship to um, can you see these here about Tokyo Rose, and I can't quite make sense of that.
Yeah, the Hanoi Hannah.
Hanoi
Yeah.
Hannah, yeah.
Um, yeah, is Hanoi Hannah like Tokyo Rose? I'm not sure, sorry.
Sorry, I put the Tokyo Rose thing in. I can't remember what Hanoi Hannah is. The Tokyo Rose was the idea of the Japanese propaganda that was being pushed out, but then Tokyo Rose ultimately was subverting that process.
Yeah, and like what was the other one? And Lord Haw Haw in World War II was a similar sort of thing, right? And again, I just don't know if these things ever really have the kind of effect that and this is another sort of interesting thing. It's like the question of effect always comes up, right? What effect did these things have? And it's very difficult to actually measure, right? I mean, ask anyone who works in the advertising industry, how do you measure the success of a campaign? It's extremely difficult. After in the sort of early 70s, the US um, commissions this suite of studies to review its psychological warfare efforts and says, what effect did it have? Any effect? Did it work? And it's just a big shoulder shrug. They just say, we don't know and we can't know. We actually don't have, like, we're unable to evaluate the effectiveness of our psychological war. So it's always a bit it's always a bit difficult, right? To measure the effectiveness.
I mean, how much of that was a result of let's say uncertainty about the, I don't know, whatever, some sort of narrow sense of effects and changing attitudes and so on. And how much was it about people couldn't agree on what this warfare was for, in the sense of like, who was it meant to affect? Is this something that's kind of almost for domestic consumption, in the sense of like building up a sense that whatever the American military could exercise some influence in parts of the world. Yeah, I don't know how much, I suppose, how much agreement was there about what it was even for, and did that influence why they got a shoulder shrug in the end? Or yeah, could you, I don't know, could you
Yeah.
could you speak to that? Yeah.
I mean, and it's similar I mean, I think a big part of it's like similar in the war on terror, right? I think this idea that they were going to win hearts and minds and be greeted as liberators and all that stuff was a way to enable the war. And as soon as you got in, it didn't really matter as much, right? Um, yeah, and I think there are these two different, as I argue this in the book as well, that there's these sort of two faces of psychological war, right? It's sort of got a Janus face in two directions. There is the one that says, that is, I think, for domestic consumption, right? The one that says psychological war is, it reflects our commitments to liberal humanitarian ideals. It makes war less kinetic and we can replace killing. And so that's the one face, and that's the face that the US likes to show to itself and to, allies and other parts of the world. But then if you're on the other end of American psychological war, it's very different, right? The other face is that it's quite extortionate. The idea is explicitly that psychological, not only is it, things like leaflets to support bombing, but bombing itself is sort of understood to be a vehicle or a medium of psychological war, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There's very different audiences for psychological war. Even the idea of what psychological war is and means is very different depending on who's being spoken to.
Okay, looks like just at this stage, a couple more questions. We've got one in the chat. So Ambrose Suriano posted her comment, so I can just read that. So I was wondering, you define psychological war as propaganda of propaganda. Today we have much more evidence than decades ago coming from territories of war that deconstruct the propaganda narrative. And it creates sharp division between the propaganda and the common opinion of people and citizens. How does this propaganda deal? How does this propaganda deal with this dynamic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this was a big part of, I mean, the problem after the First World War, right? Is that people came to, like, there was a big boom in literature in the interwar years of books and pamphlets that discussed and debunked the propaganda campaigns of the First World War, and it made propaganda such a bad word. I think, as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's one of the reasons why I think psychological war was appealing. You could say, oh, well, we're not doing propaganda. That's a sort of bad and vulgar thing that, maybe authoritarians do. What we're doing is good and liberal and technical and informed by social science, and it's productive. So again, that's this idea that it's sort of a propaganda about propaganda. But then again, I mean, I do think there's something too, to kind of go back to the previous question about sort of the contemporary sort of like paranoid. There's two people in the room who've written an article called PSYOP Realism about PSYOPs today, which is a really good article. And this kind of like paranoid contemporary discourse on the right about PSYOPs of propaganda, and I think it's definitely connected to the fact that we came to know just in, you know, the entire first decade of the War on Terror, we did come to see there was a lot of debunking. We came to see how much our leaders lied to us about that war, and I think that really broke like a fundamental covenant in a lot of ways, right? I think a lot of people like to put the sort of post-truth malaise on Trump, who certainly doesn't help, of course, but I really think the seeds of this kind of era we're living in were set before that, and I think it ties to the War on Terror and the what we've come to know, I guess, about the type of like domestic propaganda from that time. So I think it's a good question. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. The first part of your response makes me wonder how this sort of thing is being portrayed in the U.S. today, given the Department of kind of War kind of footing or whatever, like not into defense anymore. Anyway, but maybe that's just Daniel, do you want to come in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I was particularly interested in this passage in your book where you talk about the kind of internal discussion about the strategy of truth, that there was not like an immediate consensus that this was the right way to go, right? And one of the arguments against it was basically that it's not a feasible epistemological position that you can even have from within this expanded sense of war as covering, you know, geographically the whole field. And so I was wondering if I got this correctly, that this idea that can we actually distinguish between true information and propaganda, or what we would call maybe disinformation as information that's being disseminated with strategic intent. That distinction itself seems to be kind of eroding or even collapsing as a consequence of what you call the geographical imaginary of psychological warfare itself, right? Where the front is everywhere. So in a way that if you follow that to its logical end, it also means that in a way there is no neutral information that doesn't have, at least in potential or in a particular context, a strategic meaning. So this leads to this kind of paradox where the imaginary of psychological warfare undermines the very idea that you can have a strategy of truth. I just want to check, like, if that is the way we should look at it. And then maybe also in the context where I'm looking at this, which is more like contemporary digital culture, and in the field of misinformation studies, which also inherited a lot of the kind of more liberal, humanist or libertarian imaginary of the digital public sphere, you know, if it's in a way true that psychological warfare operates on populations, operate on public opinion, like, does that kind of undermine the distinction between information and disinformation, or between these different typologies of information which we use to think about the contemporary contested and weaponized status of information in online environments, maybe as an addition?
Yeah, thanks. Those are really, really excellent questions and really big questions as well. Yeah, you've pointed to, I think, a really important contradiction that you see all the time in discussions about propaganda, especially when you see, you know, if you read through kind of like oversight, like a Pentagon you know, the Pentagon's been accused of doing some kind of propaganda. And so it'll go through an inspector general's report, and then the inspector general will say, well, you know, there's no such thing, you know, so they'll say at once, well, we only tell the truth, right? So so you don't have to worry because we won't tell any lies. And that's sort of like, there's like sort of an epistemological double bind here, right? Well, they'll say we only tell the truth, but, well, there's no such thing as an absolute truth. So of course, everything is going to be influencing, right? So this idea that yeah, you can have, and they'll kind of like come down to say, well, of course we were influencing in this situation where maybe we shouldn't have been, but all information influences. There's no such thing as neutral value-free information. So because all information influences, then we have no choice but to do this, or that there's no way we can possibly check ourselves, right? So there's this kind of like double epistemology around what truth is there that's flexible enough to kind of avoid any, I guess, institutional oversight, right?
Yeah.
And so you've correctly like identified that that contradiction, and I think it's unresolved. I think it is just it's just suspended.
Yeah, yeah. It also reminds me of, I think it's Philip Mirowski, who wrote on like game theory and the relation to like neoliberal economics. And there he talks about all these game theoretical paradoxes. That in a way, like if you don't believe that there is any neutral free information, you still have to present it, in a kind of public setting. So I think that speaks to the epistemology of secrecy. Like internally, you would know that, yeah, it's basically indistinguishable from strategic communication. But for that very reason, the way you present it to the outside, it has to be in absolute terms as being true, or as being superior to other modes of information.
Yeah, and I think your point too about the like the information misinformation or disinformation kind of framework. Yeah, I think you're correct to identify those as having these sort of like, liberal baggage to them. What I find so interesting about the idea of disinformation is again the assumption that there's some like there exists a type of information that has a normative political effect, and and disinformation is a departure from that, is a departure from information sort of presumed normativity. What is that normativity? I don't really know, right? But it's sort of an unstated principle of a lot of those like frameworks of information, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation kind of thing. I really like malinformation. That's my favorite one because it's like this is true information, but it's bad. We don't want it. We gotta, yeah.
Yeah, great. I mean, there's so much there, and it reminds me of too of Iran-Contra affair and Oliver North, presenting himself as the honest liar, and the way in which that kind of double bind kind of, I mean, you see it, in different, I mean, it manifests itself in all sorts of discussions about these kinds of topics, about deception and war and so on, right? And it's just kind of reoccurring about how can someone position themselves as kind of skilled in dissimulation, okay, but this telling the truth, maybe, right?
I think this is like what the strategy of truth is kind of about, right? It's sort of it's a profession of innocence, right? It's like also, so it is a strategy. It's like, I think it was a recognition that if things look too much like propaganda, which they really did in the First World War, right? They really looked like propaganda, that if things look too much like that, then they're not going to work. You have to use this sort of um, dulcet tones of journalistic objectivity. Like that's actually just more rhetorically effective than something that looks really like emotionally inflected, right? But you did have people, Brian, you mentioned there like this like idea of the noble lie. Like you did have lots of conservatives who just didn't like the strategy of truth. They thought it was sort of stupid, and they would say, "No, we like what we need to be do is doing more noble lies." That was their sort of
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Long tradition of that, hey?
yeah.
Okay, maybe our last question, and it'll come from Sultan. I think it's going to build on the discussion we just had, but I think asking you to kind of reflect on some like more whatever say modern day equivalents. So the question is, could you please reflect on the framing theory and propaganda correlation in the digital age of social media? Yeah, so cash it out today for us in relationship to social media, please.
Again, that's a really big question. I'm not sure exactly about the framing theory per se, but Yeah, I mean, this has been kind of the big question that people have been trying to figure out for the last 10 years or so, is like how is social media affecting things. And I'm of two minds of this, right? I mean, it definitely, social media has in some ways produced the collapse of consensus reality that we're all sort of bemoaning, right? Is like we don't like, at least when we're all watching the same news program at night or the same newspaper or something, we kind of had a shared touchstones and we could disagree with them or whatever. And that was its own kind of problem for, yeah, framing. And um, that's a very gameable system. And so it seems like a lot of the chaos now is that we don't have that kind of shared or consensus reality. Yeah, truth making, as Elphys was saying. But then again, social media also, there is something still a bit, I don't want to totally concede the train of social media, because there is like liberatory potential there, I think, right? I mean, how do we know about so much of what's happened in Gaza, for example, right? It was mostly come out of social media. I mean, has that had a big effect? I mean, I guess that's a different question. But there is something about social media about getting some, and of course it's not unfiltered, unmediated, but I think there is something still there. I mean, the problem I think about social media now is the way that platforms are becoming monopolized, right? So I think it's really, the question about social media is a political economic question, I think, kind of now. And yeah, I don't know how much I can say about social media writ large, but I mean, this is a huge, like, this is a really interesting thing to do more research on, right? I think that's a really, really great topic.
Yeah. Political economy of truth, I guess, is yeah, a big story to tell there. Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff, for this this overview, and thanks everyone for attending. If you're interested in finding out more events along these lines, please have a look for the Spin Network. There's a nice website we have. There's all sorts of events coming up. If you're if you're interested in more kind of book launches along these lines, we have kind of reading groups where we share about our current research, just discussions and feedback sessions and so on. So please do get in touch if you want to find out more. And yeah, otherwise, again, thanks, Jeff, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Elphys, for organizing, and thanks everyone for attending and asking great questions.
Okay, lovely. Okay, cheers then. Okay.
Thank you both.